Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Mary had a little lamb, row, 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 row.
Manson was also almost certainly had some affiliation with the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which was also kind of a Scientology offshoot, and read Crowley. And then the Process Church of the Final Judgment is involved in all kinds of nefarious activities. Not just Manson, but also the Sons of Sam.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural. Welcome, listeners, to another episode. Today, I'm going to begin the episode by drawing in a distinction. One that was used all the way back in the medieval period, that they used to make a distinction in every form of science. They divided their science into three things: the material object, the formal object, and the method. The material object is the thing you are studying. So in the case of chemistry, for example, you are studying the properties, composition, and behavior of matter, and the interaction between them and that kind of thing. In biology, you are studying living organisms and the interactions with the environment, and that type of thing, such as genetics or ecology. The formal object is the perspective that you take on it. So human beings can be studied from a biological point of view, or from a chemical point of view. Or they can be studied from a theological or a philosophical point of view. So you can have the same material object, in this case a human, but looked at from different points of view, from a biological, from a chemical, from a theological, philosophical view. And then that perspective that you take on it determines what is called the method. Because obviously the method which is used in biology is going to be different from the method used in chemistry. It's different in the method of philosophy or theology. And so there's the method it is determined or based upon the particular view you take in a relationship to the thing you are studying. And so there is the method, and it is determined or based upon the particular viewpoint you take in relationship to the thing you are studying. Now, the result of all this is that the sciences, plural, sciences, are not just quote-unquote the empirical science. A science is defined as an organized body of knowledge of things through their causes. In other words, I have a scientific knowledge about something because I know what causes it, what brings it into being, what affects it, and that type of thing. In the context of our episode today, and that what we are going to talk about is important to psychology, and it is the study of the human in mind and behavior. Humans can actively do things in their mind that do not require their body to act in a behavioral manner. The human can use its mind to think about its thoughts. It does not need to behave in a manner that reflects those thoughts either. Humans are more than a mere base animal. In this way, when one learns about psychology, it is important to remember that the human consists of more than what they do, their behavior, but also what is in their mind. What do they think about? How do they process thoughts? How does their cognition work? We learn that humans have a thing called dignity, and that is given to them by God, their creator, and that dignity is not part of their behavior alone or of their mind alone, but because it is a result of what they are as imagers of God. And to unpack that, it means that the human, in their behavior and in their mind, is supposed to reflect the actions and the activity and the thoughtfulness of their creator. Therefore, as we talk about psychology in this episode, we're going to be talking about two different forms. We're talking about the sociopath and the psychopath. And we're going to invest time to looking at these not merely as behavioral traits alone, but also as part of the individual's mind space. With your mind comes some level of intelligence, and all intelligences can be influenced directly or indirectly by another intelligence. We are looking at these ideas of a sociopath or a psychopath theologically and philosophically. We therefore agree with the conclusion that other fields of science say of this. We agree with when the psychologists talk about the psychopath or the sociopath. But we investigate further and look at the other identifiers in this matter that could be a result of something within this theological framework, that the mind can be influenced by another being of pure intellect. I speak of the spirit. We have spoken about beings of pure intellect and how they are commonly called spirits by Christian theologians, and we shall maintain this identifier. A spirit being is a pure intellect. It can use its power of intellect and can focus its attention, if you will, upon a target of its interest. For example, the angel Gabriel did not have to ask directions on how to get to Mary's bedchamber. It could think it and would be there. The angel did not have to ask directions on how to get to the Holy of Holies, where John's father Zechariah was. It could think it and be there. The intellect of pure spirit is not constrained by time, space, or matter. Therefore, it is entirely possible for the sociopath or the psychopath to have their mind space invaded by a malicious entity that has nothing but malevolent intent. While a spirit that is bringing a message from God would clearly establish its own barriers and not violate the will of the Father, which would also include human free will, the sinister forces do not work with such a duty to uphold a human free will and therefore will, when able, bring to bear its own intellect and influence a human's mind. Therefore, what we understand of sociopaths is that the cause of this antisocial personality disorder is relatively unknown. Genetic factors and environmental factors such as child abuse are believed to contribute to the development, and people with an antisocial or alcoholic parent are at increased risk, and the studies show that men are more likely to be sociopaths than women. What we know about the psychopath is that there are many childhood risk factors for contributing to this mental disorder, including poverty, housing instability, parental conflict, divorce, negative peer influences, lack of parental involvement, exposure to crime or violence, and legal or criminal problems within the family. These are summarized and minimized definitions of both terms because a deeper examination would take far longer than a forethought would allow. However, something of interest to me is the religious practice of a shaman and how this ties in. There are many traditions, and therefore I do not intend to limit or minimize the effects or the reality of this particular practice within their cultural context. However, looking at it philosophically or theologically, from what I have found, that there are some who would say the process of becoming a shaman puts them at odds with their own society and culture. They often live on the outskirts of their own villages. People have to come to them. They don't go to people. There are traditions that some who go to become a shaman, they're on the shaman quest, and if they fail the trial, they might become something called a shape changer. And in that particular tradition, they can possess others, can disguise themselves, and they are often extremely wicked and evil. The process changes who they are into something not quite right with the world. Is it therefore merely an act upon the individual that has changed them thus? Or could there have been unseen forces that have pushed them over the boundary into chaos? Perhaps these untapped shamans have shape changed into what they are because the healthy mode of dealing with the disorder and dystopia of the world actually causes them to go over the top. In any case, the mind is a labyrinth of possibilities, and the body is an expression of many of them. Understanding that some fall prey to the intellect of the sinister forces as a real possibility, as the sane returning from their vision quest, the end is the same. How will we handle the paradox of the unseen and what we can experience? Shall we look into the abyss and shrink once it looks back? Or shall we take the fight to the enemy and claim our crown of victory? The fact that we know that there is something spooky in the world, and most pastors and priests pass over the reality of the supernatural battle that impacts your very soul, expecting you to maintain a simple life, yet know how unaware you are of the sinister forces, the thread of evil that has woven itself in and out of every major power since the dawn of the fall of man, cannot merely be traced, but is well documented in the lives of the depraved. This is where my guest comes in. He's an attorney, an author, and a researcher, delving into the realms of devil worship, bringing light to the shadows cast by Luciferianism, mucking around the filth of the death cults, and unveiling the hidden layers of history that have shaped our world. May I introduce William Ramsey, author of Prophet of Evil, Children of the Beast, to name a couple of his books. Join us as we explore the depths, truth, and darkness. William Ramsey, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for the invite. Great to be here. Great to be with you.
We talked about angels, we've talked about some demons, we've talked about some of the named powers on either side of the veiled side for a little bit, but the thing is those entities on the other side of the veil, they like to bleed into our realm.
Right.
And they like to influence people. And one of the individuals in Children of the Beast that you go through is John Lawson, who changed his name to Pazuzu.
Yeah, I came across this story as I was writing Children of the Beast back in 2014. It was of this guy who was pretty much a modern kind of demon worshiper or demonologist. So I found him to be very unique, and there was a kind of a trace of his social media around. And so I thought it was important to kind of memorialize it. And he was from, I think it was North or South Carolina, if I remember correctly, but he looked like there's pictures of him as like a normal, kind of looks like a little skate kid who transformed himself into this devil worshipping, ritual, magic, blood drinking, really kind of a monster who filed his teeth down like what Aleister Crowley supposedly did as well. But the sad truth is that he had victims. We know that he had 2 bodies were buried in his backyard, believed to have been killed in 2009. And so, he was a very dark character. Pazuzu, for people who may not remember or recall, is the demon that is featured in the film The Exorcist.
Talking about these things that traverse time in not just people, but also in symbols or icons, if you will, and how they can become manifest. And John Lawson becoming Pazuzu, there was a real interesting story about how he came to an end. Did you cover that?
Well, he was arrested and in jail, and he supposedly bit himself and bled to death, yeah.
Right. Yeah, bruises and broken ribs and things like that in his padded cell kind of thing.
So he was, very dark character. Face tattoos, menacing, rituals at night, eating rabbits. Like, he was on a roll. That was something else. And one of the reasons that draw my attention is, like, my book was about Aleister Crowley. So he had a kind of an infamous picture of Crowley up on his wall, as well as kind of other things that I didn't realize at the time. He was interested in Arabic,
right,
which would and could possibly tie him to the Order of Nine Angles, which kind of had a strange overlap. Yeah, but I didn't notice that in 2014. I wasn't aware of that. So maybe it's probably worth my while to go back and revisit his records. I know there was a really good documentary that came out about him, the 4-part documentary that may have exposed some stuff. But yeah, he was sophisticated.
Yeah, because when we explore the sinister forces, we also identify that there is an intellect, so we can look at it psychologically. we can analyze these behaviors. And so we can analyze the behaviors that these guys do, and we would typically call them sociopaths or psychopaths, that people who basically fall off the deep end and then they manifest and then they act on their manifestations.
Right, and it's interesting you make those terms, this psychopath, sociopaths, because these people are they're outside of the standard psychological definitions, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. So I think that those terms do apply, but they don't address the totality of their character, because oftentimes they're thinking, like you said, they're intelligent. And so the courts actually kind of would call them those terms and actually call them insane, but it's almost like they're not that crazy. There's something else going on. There's a spiritual dimension, something additional.
Yeah, there is an author who had addressed that the issue, there's this parallelism between shamanism and the idea of the rituals associated usually with indigenous peoples groups and their shamanist practices, and the idea of a sociopath, basically these people going out and they're deprived and depraved kind of people, and they lead to something, and they usually come back. The shaman's going to come back and he's going to work for good, but the shaman who doesn't come back is turned into like a skinwalker, according to some Native American myths, and that would seem to correlate with they're sociopathic. There's they act out, they hurt people, they kill people, they do things to animals, cannibalism, in a ritualistic manner, not a simple, this is part of my culture, this is not normal behavior. And if we're talking about shamans, we can also talk about someone like Aleister Crowley, who clearly went through some kind of initiation process, and he called himself the Beast. But that comes from his past, doesn't it?
Yeah, he kind of absorbed a lot of things from the Book of Revelation, so he adapted that into his kind of worldview and outlook, so I think that was kind of his take. But I think that there's probably similarities between Crowley, Lawson, aka Pazuzu, and kind of shamanism. There's something strange about them kind of doing these rituals to gain power or communicate with the other side. Like that was Crowley's kind of goal his whole life, from in his early 20s to the end, was like communicating with entities and things like that.
My listeners know that I have kind of a dark occult background myself, and called the entities that I was faced with basically these shadows on the threshold, demons of the crossroads, those kinds of things. And I didn't have as much internet access back in the late 90s, early thousands and stuff. I mean, for internet research, not a whole lot of stuff going on, so I had to do it the hard way and walk around and talk to people. But I was looking into Aleister Crowley, and then I've started thinking about it since that time, since I converted to Christianity, and started really looking at these guys. And it makes me wonder, with John Lawson, if he didn't hear from some kind of being, some kind of sinister force. And I draw that because I look at Aleister Crowley's life, and there's a couple of entities that he speaks to, and one of them's Lamb, and the other was Awas.
Among many others. Yeah.
Hey, as we shift gears to discuss how others are impacted by these sinister forces, I wanted to take a moment to ask the listeners for their continued support.
Right.
Liking, sharing, and subscribing not only helps us spread awareness, but also gives a voice to those affected. Now let us dive into the impact the sinister forces had on others. Did you talk about Jack Parsons in your book?
In Children of the Beast, yes, I did, in detail.
Okay,
I have a whole chapter about him.
Now, I don't know as much about Jack Parsons as I think you might have talked about in your book. Could you talk to my listeners about him for a bit?
Well, Crowley considered Parsons to be his number one disciple, and Parsons was not even close to Crowley. He grew up in Pasadena. He was kind of lived in a very nice, I would call it upper class at that time. He might not have recognized it as such, but he was a talented, curious young guy who was into the occult, but also into rocketry of all things. So he was one of these founding members of what became JPL, or Jet Propulsion Labs. Some people had a little play on words. They called it Jack Parsons Labs, But his real name was Marvel Whiteside Parsons, actually. And so he was born in 1914 and died after Crowley. Crowley died in 1947, and Parsons died under somewhat mysterious circumstances after something exploded. He was always toying around with explosives and rocketry, and his group, they actually called themselves, or were referred to as the Suicide Squad because they're always, getting close to blowing themselves up. He said he met Satan when he was 13, so his kind of occult, his occult interest started very early. And so then he kind of started the Agape Lodge, and inside the Agape Lodge, there's a show, I forgot what the name of it is, but it was produced recently about this whole story. But inside the Agape Lodge was a huge picture of Crowley, and he was in contact with Crowley and writing to Crowley. And there's actually a picture of him doing ritual magic in my book, close to Hollywood, kind of like in east of downtown Hollywood. And it has the classic standard Gnostic Mass that Crowley designed. But he made the oath of the Antichrist. He was anti-Christian like Crowley. Knew L. Ron Hubbard, so he's with Hubbard. Exactly. So they had kind of like a friendship as well as an animosity after Hubbard ran off with his then wife, Parsons' wife.
Marjorie something.
Marjorie Cameron became his Scarlet Woman.
That's right.
But there was another woman whose name escapes me right now. But they kind of shared. They had each of them had a romantic relationship with her.
To do the Babylon working.
Right. So that was kind of the famous story, the Babylon working, where he went out. And these workings is much like Crowley. They take place over time. So this one took place over I think it was 1946, between the 4th and the 15th of January. And they would drive out to the desert and do these things. And their whole goal was kind of to facilitate this kind of change in energy, kind of like to facilitate Crowley's new aeon, actually. So they had this...
Right. And then Crowley advised them to not do it, if I remember correctly.
Right. He said, what is up with these louts and something like that. So he was kind of dismissive of them. Yeah, so they were, it was 46. So they would do this. They would travel out into the Mojave. And actually and then Hubbard kind of ran off with Parsons' money and his girlfriend, and then started Dianetics in 48 and Scientology in 50. So it all kind of came pretty closely after each other.
Yeah, that's what I call the new occult revival, which really seems to kick off actually at the death of Crowley in December of 47.
Right.
Because we've got Kenneth Hanger and L. Ron Hubbard, Gerard Gardner's really kicking off at this time.
Right, Gerald Gardner, yeah.
Leading up into the 60s.
Yeah, and then McMurtry, who knew Crowley face-to-face, was associated with Parsons. So there's actually a tie between, like a physical tie. And McMurtry would go on to kind of be the head of the Caliph and ended up in Berkeley with the kind of Crowleyan lodge. And there's parts in my book where McMurtry is hanging out with Jacques Vallée. People know that name from UFO.
Yep.
And also Robert Anton Wilson. So there's these strange overlaps of these kind of literate figures and Crowley, and this kind of pushing of this magical current or whatever to the present day. And believe it or not,
that current really, you're in Los Angeles, right?
Right.
So not too far away from you guys is Hollywood, and then that Laurel Canyon area, isn't it?
Right. Yeah.
Charles Manson, he begins to kick off his deal. They really grab a hold of Helter Skelter, which was the White Album from the Beatles song, and it begins the Tate murders, etc.
Right, so that's 69. So there's a lot of strange stuff, and there's all kinds of rumors about Manson being associated with a Crowley offshoot called the Solar Temple, there was a lodge outside of USC. So they were saying Manson was familiar with that, and Manson was also almost certainly had some affiliation with the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which was also kind of a Scientology offshoot and read Crowley. So and then the Process Church of the Final Judgment is involved in all kinds of nefarious activities, not just Manson, but also the Sons of Sam and things like that.
Right. Yeah, so it's clear that there's definitely, it's either the same thread or we're talking about a fabric that is being woven by multiple threads into a tapestry of darkness.
Agreed. And then one of the Crowleys, another guy we mentioned is Kenneth Anger, who also sat with, his name was Bobby Bouzoulet, who was an associate of Manson, who really took orders from Manson to kill Hinman and ended up in jail, but he was living with Anger and saw Anger was a full-on warlock. And so these guys are all into kind of the occult, but their cultural impact in the United States can't be underestimated. It's just that still people are still talking about it in true crime and cultural circles to this day.
Yeah, and that's modern times, and that's because we have the access, the literary access, and everybody can read or listen to stuff on their own and have access to these things. But there's plenty of evidence that shows that this goes back in time. Ancient Sumeria, we've got stuff kicking off in there, changing the way people think, and it goes all the way through time. It's clearly something.
No doubt. Something in the human condition. It's a part of the human condition.
It is definitely part of the human condition. You interview some of these really great people who have been in it.
Yeah, I've talked to the two occult rejects. One guy was a member of the OTO, so he knew kind of about what was going on with Crowley and all that stuff. And these guys think that magic works. They're not kind of naive about it. They kind of are believers in this ceremonial magic stuff. And then the other one, I think, was a member of the Golden Dawn, of which Crowley was a member going back to England at the turn of the 19th century. So that kind of group is kind of...
At the first occult revival.
Yeah, right, exactly. So that was like the time of Blavatsky, and kind of Eastern mysticism was making its way into the West in a way that it had never done in the past. And Crowley was part of that too. But so these guys, they talk about their stories, the initiations and the rituals and what they think about a lot of the Kabbalah. They know a lot about the Kabbalah and use the Kabbalah much like Crowley did. So those are some people. I've talked to a guy who was associated with Genesis P. Orridge, kind of a transhumanist androgyne, even before what's happening today. So that's his name was, I can't remember it right now, but that was kind of one of the post-World War II occult movements, was this group, Temple of Psychic Youth. So, these guys have first-person insights kind of into the modern occult, current, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that's exactly what it would be. That's what I call it. It's definitely a current. It flows, weaves its way through everything. There was an incident, the Black Dahlia murder. Did you write about that in any of your books?
I have not written about it, but I'm familiar with it because it happened in LA. But that's also like another occult crime that clearly had some kind of Hollywood and like occult element to it. There's just no question about it. I think that was 47 too, right? She was 40. It was 1947, which is a really kind of a huge year. Yeah.
We've got UFOs popping off in Washington State, got New Mexico, Roswell happening, all these weird things that, some people...
Crowley dies.
Crowley dies in the December, and the CIA kicks off.
The NSA, yeah, the National Security Act, which is CIA, yeah.
And then MK Ultra really starts getting its start.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's like a really post-war kind of lever fulcrum year, where everything changed into something new. Wow.
Let's see, Crowley Theosophy, Ariosophy, that's Guido von List, the Nazis, Sabotendorf, which was kind of an amusing character. He tries to have a wizard duel. He's like Harry Potter versus Voldemort, with Aleister Crowley. Wants to surrender for Germany.
Yeah, Sabotendorf is interesting. There's all kinds of occultists around the Nazis and the German right. It's incredible. Another one is Ewers. If you know, you can look him up. He was a writer and author, and is the tie between Hitler and Crowley. Ewers, you can say Evers, E-V-E-R-S, right? So he was in the States the time Crowley was, so he's friends with Crowley and some of the people in Crowley's circle, and then goes back to Germany and becomes part of the Nazi Party, and literally had an office. I think it was... what's the propaganda minister? It's Goebbels gives him an office of like literature or something in the Nazi Party. So pretty remarkable that they actually use some kind of tie between the Nazis and Crowley.
And then if we move to something that's a little bit more modern, there's the satanic group. They call themselves the Order of Nine Angles you make mention of. What kind of information or ideas can we draw out of this?
A lot. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. It's kind of a newer kind of movement that referenced all of these other occult groups, right? And I show that in my book. Like, their guy who kind of formulated the original scripts back in the 70s and 80s, his name was David Myatt, and he kind of wanted to distinguish kind of an occult group from these other occult groups that were out there, such as the Temple of Set or the Church of Satan. And really what he said distinguishes is that our ability to kill, right? They were murderers. And so there's actually writings between him and the Temple of Set and Michael Aquino individually. So they know of each other. And they also know of kind of other chaos magicians as well. Their corpus is fairly new, and it really took off during the internet. So it's become a global phenomenon, which I reference in my book, Global Death Cult. It has a completely different kind of basis. It grew out of the occult right-wing political groups in the UK. So it has this kind of overlap with occultism of Nazis. So it's kind of like a satanic, well, I guess it's kind of redundant because the Nazis were an occult satanic.
Yes, they were, right.
Political party. So I think that it's just a kind of a carry on and kind of a more modern sensibilities with a new corpus of writing, really. But really their basis is finding an offer or sacrifice, and going up their scale is to kind of kill somebody and get away with it.
Yeah, they're basically the modern day assassins kind of people, the Ashashin, where they would go and
or the thugs.
Exactly. They'd go out and they'd kill, and if they got caught, that's fine, because that's all part of their religion.
Right. Yeah, so that's it.
And the one thing that's important for everybody to understand is cultists who are serious about it, they have just as much faith in their beliefs as any Christian, Muslim, Buddhist may have. And that's the hard thing to understand, is because we're not just dealing with someone who's like, oh, this is all woo-woo. We're dealing with people who have faith in it.
Well said. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Who have faith in the unseen.
I mean, they have a spiritual worldview. So, like, a lot of people, are you religious? What's your spiritual? And some people may mistakenly believe that context is like you're religiously Christian or Orthodox Jewish or something. But some of these people are spiritual and faithful to some of the darkest ideas. Going back to Pazuzu is a perfect example, because the dark gods of the Order of Nine Angle Pantheon go back to Sumeria. And I don't think Pazuzu's involved, but there's all these other strange entities that are very similar to kind of the work of Lovecraft, yeah.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, is Pazuzu wasn't necessarily a demon of blood sacrifice. In fact, there's no Sumerian evidence that it was a blood sacrifice entity. It was more used to scare Lamashtu, its wife, to stay away from other people's babies. In that way, it was kind of a protector gargoyle, if you will, to the Sumerians. And it was drawn forward into The Exorcist because the Ashurbanipal library and stuff like that was recently discovered and was really getting its promulgation through upper echelon education and stuff.
Interesting.
There's other people that deal with or desire some kind of occult power, even if they don't think it's occult, making themselves better musically.
Right.
Robert Johnson, he was a blues player who really couldn't play the guitar all that well, and he went out to a crossroads and called forth, he's a Cajun kind of guy, and so he calls whatever voodoo god out. And he basically comes back into town and he can play the guitar like no one they've known before. And it's clearly some kind of, they called it at the time, supernatural.
Yeah, those crossroads are still, there's a famous kind of crossroads with the statuary there where it happened south of Memphis,
Yeah.
in the south.
There's definitely musicians that get something, or they're CIA plants, right?
Something strange. Which, I mean, the CIA is so spooky and like Hogwarts that it's almost like an occult group anyway. It has kind of a very sterile, kind of modern, scientistical sensibility to all the writing and things like that, but its underbelly is occult all the way. I mean, they're trying to... The MK Ultra is a perfect example. It's like mind control, and a lot of occultism has that aspect to it, and I've seen it permeate through all these things, which is the ability to control other people's minds, not just their own.
Yeah. Yeah, the men who stare at goats, right? That's the reference I give for people to understand MK Ultra.
Right, and it's more than that. I mean, it was a very vast project. A lot of people don't comprehend. They kind of laugh. Some people, like, who haven't read into it, they like kind of laugh it off. No, these guys had 149 sub-projects filtered through, spread out throughout the entire United States with very smart, top-of-the-line psychiatrists and psychologists with unlimited funds doing all kinds of strange tests and everything. Hypnotism, drugs, the whole bit.
What I say is, I think there's groups out there that understand how to hack the human brain like it's a computer. I mean, it's not a computer, but it's basically a computer. And they've been around for millennia, and they know exactly what button to push. They know how to control Alt-Delete. They know all of those things. And that's who you're up against when you start looking at someone like Tom DeLonge or the guy who wrote the Simon Necronomicon, Peter Levenda.
Yeah, he knows a lot.
We're starting to look at these people through this lens that these are guys that have been exposed to sinister forces.
Very well said, just like L. Ron Hubbard. I mean, the whole Scientology is one mind control cult, like it's very well integrated. And, I mean, his own son said it was like occultism drawn out over time, but they have a lot of that MK Ultra kind of ideology bleeds into that group, like suggestion and hypnosis and social attachment. I mean, just all kinds of themes about my social control are in Scientology, which is why a lot of those guys have a hard time getting out. And when they get out, they're still messed up.
Or they're jumping on Oprah Winfrey's couch, screaming how much they love somebody.
You actually can't really get out. You have to, they have a file on every one of their members and all their everything, naughty stuff and
all their dark everything. It's basically blackmail.
Yeah, no, it's blackmail.
And you've also done research on serial murderers, because we did talk about sociopath earlier with Lawson, but you've done the West Memphis 3.
Correct. Yeah, I wrote a book about them in 2012.
Right, and you've been working on a new book about the smiley face killers?
Correct, I just published it. It's a 400-page book. It's really kind of like the finishing of 7 years of research. It really goes back to 2016 when I first got interested in it. I've done 2 documentaries, and then I figured there were so many things that happened in the last year and a half that were mandated, or I felt like I should put it all into book form, all that research and kind of the unraveling of the understanding of this new phenomenon of young men out at night getting separated from friends who are later disappeared, later be found in water. Nobody sees them go into the water, but they are found dead in water. And the numbers in the world, I think my cases in the book, it's like 350 or 360 cases. But I think I actually have another 100 cases that I could put back in that book. So it is a significant number of deaths. I don't think it's just one person doing it. I think it's a group, and it might be coordinated. And they have their own kind of ideology and symbolism. And smiley face is one of their symbols.
All right, fantastic. Is there some stuff you can give my audience on where to find you, some hints about your documentaries, things like talk about what you want?
Yeah, actually, you can watch all 5 of my documentaries on Patreon for $5. I think it's a pretty good deal. So you can have hours of I've done 2 documentaries on the smiley face killers. I've covered the subjects in my book. I've done Occult Hollywood. You can see the smiley faces on that. And I've done a treatment on Fight Club, which the book itself has all kinds of smiley face references. And Tyler Durden's a 5 and a 6, right? So it's 11, the magic. So Palahniuk knows all that stuff. But I've got a Children of the Beast documentary that's 3 hours long, one on Prophet of Evil. So you can see that on Patreon. I got a ton of information just on my website, some of my old writing, some articles that aren't even in my books, which is William Ramsey Investigates. You can buy my books there. And then my podcast is in the top 0.5% podcasts in the world. And I have on my way to 1,100 episodes on all kinds of stuff. I've done a lot of true crime. I've done a lot of film analysis, cultural analysis, some Christian stuff that I've done. Just on, there's a little something for everyone.
There is.
When some people find stuff, I did a recent one on Adelson, this Adelson family, where The family members have been arrested for the killing of one of the members' ex-husbands. That happened in Florida. So, there's a little bit of just trying to keep my finger on the pulse of a lot of different things going on in the world. There's a lot of material out there, there's no question. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, was that... No, I was thinking of the Sodder children disappearance. That was different.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. I've done one on the family, right? This kind of weird pedophile group that went around Florida.
Yeah.
That comes to mind, which CIA ties and occult ties.
So you got anything in the pipeline?
I've got 2 projects I'm trying to finish by the end of the year, and I'm doing a really good job procrastinating on them, but I'm trying to get them done. And I'm starting my own publishing company, so I'm looking for people. If you have any submissions, send them to WilliamRamseyInvestigates@gmail.com.
Are you doing Amazon as your publications, or?
I'm going to try to get it out to as many kind of retail outlets of any books that I can. So I'll publish on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, whatever, and self-publish. I mean, it's much easier these days for even a smaller publisher, a smaller book author to get your book kind of into the, highway or the internet superhighway through Amazon.
Into the hands of anybody who's got a Kindle, really, or want to print it out.
Yeah, true.
Fantastic, William. I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You as well. Thanks for having me on. Good to be with you.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.